Begin. Okay, welcome folks. It's HUL256, lecture number 11, the start of week 6. So, yeah.
So sorry to cut you off. Would there be a lecture at 6:30 with the?
Yeah. I announced on Piazza. It's not a lecture. It's just a discussion with Shujoy.
Yeah.
6:30 to 7:30.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
So yes, in fact, that was going to be my first announcement. So for those who missed it, as you know, we had that guest lecture with Vaishya Datta, I guess the week before last, and he's very kindly agreed to uh, come and hang out for a 1-hour open-ended chat session from 6:30 to 7:30. So I hope at least some of you will come for that. There was a fair amount of enthusiasm when I proposed the idea, but there are fewer people here than there were last week, so I don't know what's happening there. Okay, so that is the announcement. So my plan this week, so last week, essentially what we covered, we've obviously been on this topic of arguments now for a while. And last week, we kind of wrapped up this first stage in the what I call the two-stage process. There's the interpretation stage, and then there's the evaluation stage. We sort of wrapped up the interpretation stage. We were looking at passages of text that contained multiple arguments, perhaps for the same conclusion, and how to separate them out, and the importance of separating them out. You recall those are the examples involving that artificial intelligence and so forth. There was one that generated a lot of discussion, and that is about sadhus and politics and secularism. I'm going to just open the window and hope this doesn't crash. Let me just get the bookmarks open here. I have a lot of files open because I'm supposed to be recording a talk very soon. Okay, current file, what do I want? We had a big discussion about this this example, and we noted that there are multiple interpretations, maybe more than one argument in here, and here we disagreed with the text, and there was also a discussion about the term secularism, and that could mean different things. So we left there, and the last I'm going to skip some of this material on how to deal with multiple possible interpretations of arguments. It's fairly straightforward, but the important thing that I want to leave you with is something that they well, actually, maybe we should let's just go through one kind of argument to see what they have in mind of how to separate arguments into a passage that's giving evidence or justification for some conclusion, how to separate it out so that the reasoning becomes a little bit clearer. That's basically the job of the interpretation stage, is to understand what is being said and kind of fair it up so that we can do better at evaluating what is said. Okay, if I can have a volunteer just to read this example here. Can I have somebody read this box? And again, somebody who's not read before. We have Hemant, who's always, I would say, the most enthusiastic of our volunteers. So let's go for the most enthusiastic volunteer. So Hemant first, and then go for it. Go for it, Hemant.
Sir, from where?
Just
The,
this box, the yellow box.
those
Yep.
street dog puppies are so cute, but they will be struggling to get food, and the older dogs will bite them and chase them away. It must be tough to be a street dog.
Okay, so let's just now go through these two versions of the argument where it's being separated into premises and conclusion. So why don't you start with the first? You start from here, P1.
Those street dog puppies will struggle to get food, and the older dogs will bite them. And if you struggle to get food and are bitten, then it is tough. Conclusion. Therefore, it must be tough to be one of those street dog puppies.
Okay, so
Those
that's one version of the argument. Uh, let's go to the next.
those street dog puppies will struggle to get food. The older dogs will bite those street dog puppies. If you struggle to get food and are bitten, then it is tough. Therefore, it must be tough to be one of those street dog puppies.
Okay, so what's the difference between these two versions of the argument? And which do you think is more helpful? Why?
I think, sir, in the first, the three, all the three premises of second argument are written in one paragraph.
Okay, so what is the advantage? Is there an advantage of separating them out?
I think, sir, yeah, this second argument is more. Second argument is good to understand easily.
It's good to understand. Okay, Sujit.
Yes, sir. Yeah, the same thing. It's good to understand because the first statement that is a kind of a slow thinking, a fast thinking that you that say that thing instantly, and then in the second you try to make other understand slowly, so other person get a little time to think about it clearly.
So I'm not sure whether the fast thinking, slow thinking is the right frame for this because we can talk about that. But certainly the other one allows you to go through the reasoning a bit more slowly, right? Because if you read this first passage, you kind of, at least if I was to read it, it goes by very fast. You think, acha, theek hai, chalo. Therefore, it must be tough. Whereas here you have some sense that, okay, there's this one claim that the puppies will get food. There's another claim that they'll bite those street puppies. Then there's the third kind of the bridge principle that gets to that stuff. Um, you can see another advantage of this is that um, it may turn out one of these premises is fault is wrong, right? Maybe the older dogs won't bite the street dog puppies, or maybe there are no older dogs around. Um, that means that part of the argument doesn't work. I mean, this is a toy argument, but the other part of the argument would still go through, right? It may still be true even if there are no older dogs. P1 might be true. Um, By the way, even P3 presumably can be separated out, right? It might be if you struggle to get food, it's tough, and if you get bitten, it's tough. So even if one strand in the argument falls, the other stays. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So if P3 is separated, then the second sentence will automatically become P2. Like if you are bitten, then it is tough, and P2 is almost the same. The older dogs will bite those puppies, so it is tough.
Is it the same? So there are two different claims. One is that the older dog will bite those puppies, and the second is a claim that it's tough being bitten.
So won't the aren't they like almost similar?
I'll throw it open to you. Do you think?
So, so
Yeah.
I think it's easier to understand because in this second argument, the link, the linking, they are interlinked, right? In the sense that the conclusion that is formed in, let's say, the first premise is linked to the context in the second premise, which makes it easier to understand for the reader.
So you're talking about which one? P1 here will struggle to get food. Is that what you're talking about? Or you're talking about the will bite?
Um, so I think forming in sentences makes it easy for understand to put it in context. Simple sentences.
Sure. That I think there's no disagreement about. I was just not sure what Piyush was after.
Sir, I was just
Let me
saying
just
that.
before let me just clarify what I was saying, and then we can talk. For this is useful too. I was talking about P3. So P3, they were suggesting is the single sentence. I'm suggesting that actually we separate this out as well. We say, let's say P3, how do you say in maths? We say P3 prime, let's say, is if you struggle to get maybe P3 double prime is if you are bitten there's one important way in which, in fact, P3 prime and P3 double prime don't capture what P3 captures. But Piyush, now what was your point?
Sir, I was saying that P3 is like the combination of P1 and P2. But if we separate P3 into two sentences, it will lose its impact and meaning as a premise.
Why do you think it's a combination of P1 and P2?
So P1 says street dog puppies will struggle to get food.
Yeah.
The first part of P3 sentence is if you struggle to get food. And P2 says older dogs will bite them. P3, the second part of P3 is they are being bitten. And the combination is saying that if you struggle to get food and are bitten, then it is tough. The only
Okay.
thing extra here is then it is tough.
That's right.
So,
So I mean, but then it is stuff is giving you some new information about the situation, right?
so, but
Then it is tough is an entirely new
giving feeling
premise.
that if you struggle to get food and then you are bitten also, then it is tough.
It's additional tough. So a very good point you're making, but let me, I think this, I just want to clear up some, at least maybe I'm creating some confusions. The argument as it is seems fine. I don't have a problem with it. And P3 as it stands has like a combination criteria. It's tough if you struggle to get food and are bitten. That's two conditions, and because it's an and, they both have to be met for that premise to be true. Right? In the way that I'm
Yes.
framing it,
Yes.
when I'm saying let's replace P3 with P3 prime and P3 double prime, that and is broken. So I'm making a I'm saying, hey, it's tough if you struggle to get food even if you aren't bitten, and it's tough to get bitten even if you don't struggle to get food. So in that sense, I'm suggesting that there's a weaker argument that this conclusion might be true even if one of P1 or P2 is false. I was offering an alternative interpretation for the passage. That is my this much is clear, and I will agree with you that P3 is saying something a bit stronger than the combination of P3 prime and P3 double prime. If I replace P3 with P3 prime and P3 double prime, that's not identical to P3. Can you see why? Do people understand that?
Yes, sir. Because of the and.
Because of the and.
What you're saying is much more like an or. If you struggle to get food or are bitten, then it's tough. That
That's
would be
right.
combination of P3 prime and P3 double prime.
So if I replaced P3 here with P3 prime and P3 double prime, I'd get a different argument. Or at least I'll get an argument that has different truth conditions. And it's a matter of interpretation whether the correct way of understanding what the author is saying is using P3 or whether it's using my P3 prime and P3 double prime. Any thoughts? And by the way, the only reason I'm thinking of P3 prime and P3, I don't think somehow the if you told the author, hey, there are no older dogs who will bite them and chase them away, I would guess that most people would not say, hey, okay, so then I'm wrong. It's not tough being a street dog. Presumably they say, yes, that's fine, but still it's not easy being a street dog because I won't get enough food. Now, does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
And part of what's happening here, again, it's showing you the inexact nature of interpretation. I think these guys are getting P3 out of this and. They're getting this and because there's an and here. And the question is whether the sense of this passage is that you have to meet both conditions in order for it to be tough, or whether it's enough to meet one condition.
Sir, if we use and mathematically here, then it will feel like we need both the conditions. But if we just see the English in a general way, then maybe one condition also implies that it is tough being a street dog.
That's right. So there's an interesting debate about how the English words, the use of the English and kind of maps on to the mathematical notion of and, which you'll be familiar with. And you can see, again, in this process of interpretation, one's trying to make the best sense of what the author is trying to say. And if you think about the process I described, I said, is the author really going to say that it's not tough if one of the conditions is not met? My own personal view is no, the author would probably think it's still tough. And that's why I think P3 and P3 double prime are a better interpretation of the passage. There's an additional lesson here, by the way, which is that if you agree with me and you think that there are mistakes in the textbook, it's kind of nice, right? It's a fun thing to read textbooks with an eye to catching out their mistakes. I remember I had a professor when I was doing my PhD, a famous logician, a man called John Burgess, who I admired a lot, and he had brought out one more, like a third revised edition of a very famous textbook in computational logic by Bouloche, Jeffrey, and Burgess. And so he was teaching this class in mathematical logic using this textbook, and he would give these cash prizes to anyone who found mistakes. I mean, cash prizes means like 25 cents. It's like I don't know, 5 rupees or something. But I remember there's a bit of competition for how, who could catch the errors. And once years back, in fact, I taught a course where I had somebody give me about these. Have you seen those gold coin chocolates? You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
So I remember I had this stack of. Sorry? Tanish, you said it?
Sir, I said, yeah, totally, I understand.
Yeah. So I didn't have real money, but I would hand out gold coin chocolates for people who got mistakes in. I can't remember what textbook it was. And then years later, one of the people who took that class, he came back after graduation and he gave me a new box of gold coin chocolates. So if we were, have I already mentioned this story to you? I feel like I have. As and when if and when we resume online, I'll try and get hold of some gold coin chocolates. Okay, so what's the take home of this example? This is a useful rule of thumb: choose your premises to ensure that the claims which may be independently questioned are in different premises. Right? So that's one reason to split this up, because we might question this claim independently and we might question this claim independently. Rajiv is asking, have I written any textbook? No, Rajiv, unfortunately, I haven't written any textbook. But if I write a textbook, I will um, provide a mechanism to to correct for errors. I think, do you guys know the name of Donald Knuth? Is that anyone doing computer science?
Yeah, so Donald Knuth, who created LaTeX, right?
He created LaTeX, and he has this um, very famous 3-volume textbook. I think it's called The Art of Computer Programming. So he also, I can't remember now, he had some system, some reward system for anyone who wrote in with a mistake in his book. All right, so digression, back to the main point. This is a good practice, so keep this principle in mind. I'm going to skip the second principle and talk a little bit about this third principle, which I mentioned. The principle of charity: always interpret an argument's premises and conclusions so that it is the strongest possible argument that the author might be making. And we saw earlier that sometimes when there's in a way a premise that's not explicit, that's not in the passage, sometimes we add something in. And the reason we add something in is because we want to consider the argument in its strongest possible form when we're at the evaluation stage. Why would we believe the principle of charity? Like, why have this principle? So the question is, why should we adopt?
So maybe to understand the best case scenario, what the author is trying to say.
Well, why do that?
Um,
What's so great about that?
so
Because in comparison, it will be the least like questionable. If we question the premises or if we question the conclusion, it will have strong points against it with comparison to others.
So is your thought that if you take the strong, suppose you disagree with somebody and you say, look, this is the strongest version of what they say, then that's this. Then our disagreement is as strong as possible. Whereas if you disagree with somebody and say, look, your argument is bad, and they say, no, I didn't mean that, I meant something stronger, then we've not made that much progress. Is that what you had meant?
Yes, a kind of, yes.
Anyone else? We spoke about this once, I think. In fact, I seem to remember.
Yes,
Yeah,
kind
Sumila,
of,
go ahead.
like the principle of charity. You mentioned that why when we like assume certain things that the author assumes that the reader knows or understands and is not explicitly stated. So to like we are trying to understand a text and we are trying to look at things from author's perspective, then it's nice to assume certain things because that will save us further useless debate. Like if you question something and then they answer that, okay, I assumed this, but okay, I'll just write it for your sake that this is my premise also, and that doesn't really is productive. Like you don't get anything out of it, out of like regarding the argument itself while questioning some certain beliefs. So I guess that's why we should adopt the principle of charity.
Yeah, I think that's part of it, and that's nicely stated. So, one reason is it's a kind of principle of respect for, somebody you're reacting to, an author or another person. It's a principle of respecting their view. And I think it's true that, as Sumita says, it can be kind of a waste of time to constantly be poking holes in their argument, and then they say, okay, this is not what I meant something more, and then, okay, now I'm going to react to that. Best to just go with the strongest possible interpretation, and then if you have a problem with that, then that's a serious problem. I think philosophers, when they like to compare themselves to debaters, or they compare philosophy with debate, one kind of thought is, look, we believe in the principle of charity because ultimately we're after the truth. That person may have the truth, I may have the truth, but we're not going to get there if we're constantly fighting on not the deepest disagreements that we have. So it's an act of also philosophical, intellectual, I don't know what the right word is, good faith, to be uh, taking the opponent's argument in the strongest possible light. I don't know much about this. I think I may have mentioned this, but there's I think in classical Indian philosophy, this notion of a Purva Paksh. Have people come across that? No. So the notion of the Purva Paksh in the context of classical debate is when you're having a debate with somebody, before you start attacking their arguments, you're supposed to be able to state their argument as clearly as possible, and they have to agree. They have to be able to say, yes, this is what I meant. So suppose I'm arguing with Sumedha. Sumedha makes some point, and I say, Sumedha, this is what I think you're saying. Here's why I think it's wrong. That first step is the Purva Paksh. This is what I think you're saying. And it's only when Sumedha agrees, yes, that is indeed what I'm saying, that then I come to the stage of evaluation. And essentially, another way of framing it is use the principle of charity to avoid needless disputes. And then you get straight to principles of evaluation. There's an interesting story. There's a famous philosopher called David Lewis, very, very brilliant philosopher. I never had the opportunity to meet him. But when philosophers, and he was at Princeton where I got my PhD, but I think he died the year I reached there. Sometimes he'd ask a question after somebody gave a talk, and he'd say, look, is this what you meant? And if this is what you meant, then I think it's wrong for this reason. And the idea was he was so good that sometimes the person giving the talk would say, David, this is not what I meant, but actually it's much better than what I initially meant. So it's kind of the use of the principle of charity to improve the other person's argument. That's the kind of at ninja level. Anish, I'm not sure I understand that. Does that count as an emoji, or is an emoji only something you can put on phones?
Actually, sir, that is a reaction.
That's a reaction, not an emoji. Okay. So
Yeah.
what did the reaction mean?
I mean, it's kind of a wow.
Okay, it's a wow. I wasn't sure. So you get it. I mean, so the principle of charity there is not just about understanding specifically what did that person mean, but stating what that person meant in the best possible light. And by the way, you can see how different that is from if you go to debate on TV or see debates between politicians. It's they seem to apply exactly the opposite principle. Try and distort what your opponent says to its maximum level, and then attack that distortion. And there's a term for that some of you may have come across called what's the term? What's the term for distorting your opponent's view and attacking the distorted version?
So what?
Something that if you look at actual debates that people conduct, especially in politics or on TV shows, often you'll find that they do the reverse of the principle of charity. They won't adopt the strongest version of what their opponent is saying. They actually distort what their opponent is saying and then attack that distortion. And I was saying that there's a word that's used for that process. And I wondered if any of you know what that word is. Or phrase. It's known as creating a straw man argument. Anyone heard of that? Straw manning, as I in puts it. Aryan clearly is also. Are you also a debater?
Yes.
Yes, you are. I seem to remember that. Okay, so what's the take-home principle of charity? Good principle of, I would say intellectual respect for another person, reduce needless quarreling. Focus on what is the actual thing that's at dispute, or the most important thing that's at dispute. All of that you do by means of applying the principle of charity, and the opposite of applying this principle of charity is this straw manning or creating a straw man argument, and that is to distort what your opponent is saying and attack that. We'll see examples of what that means after the break. Okay, so that's it as far as this whole interpretation element of the course is concerned. Let's put it all together and just do one quick example, and then we can take a break and we'll turn to the next topic. So let's see an example from here. So let's look at number 11, and I think it was Arin who had volunteered. So Arin, why don't you read this passage? This is starting "We, the elite of India."
So the real pro?
Yeah.
We, the elite of India, are to blame for the state of our cities. Delhi's will of function as independent city-states with their own security, water filtration and supply, power backups, and now air purifiers. Our kids don't study in government schools. We don't use public transport. We don't seek treatment at government hospitals. With no stake in public services, we don't demand better quality for that. For that matter, any quality at all. By Hindustan
Okay.
Times.
So what's the conclusion of the passage?
Sir, it's saying that the so-called elite people, what we call ourselves, like who all have graduated from top tier colleges or something, what should I say? We disparage government facilities. Like we hate to use any kind of public transport as it will lower our dignity, I should say, for a lack of a better
But
word.
remember, I was asking Aaron not for a kind of restatement of what's being said, but just the conclusion of the argument in that premise conclusion form.
So the conclusion is the people of the city are to be blamed for the condition, bad condition.
Not the people, right? The elite people.
Elite people of this
Yeah.
country are to be.
So what are the premises?
So the premise is we don't support government facilities first.
Okay.
And the second is we don't expect, since we don't support, actually second is leading from the first premise that we don't expect them to be better.
That's it. Do we need to add something to reach the conclusion? is it enough to say that elites don't use and don't demand better quality?
At least that's what the passage says.
That's what the passage says.
Yeah.
But if we are applying the principle of charity, are there some implicit premises?
One thing is that government will only improve the quality when there is much demand for improvement.
Yeah, so we'd have to improve. We'd have to.
And there isn't much demand. That's the point.
You might think another premise could be that the reason that, or this is maybe a restatement, Sumedha, what you're saying, the reason that these services are in poor shape is that elites don't demand better quality.
Sir,
Yeah,
I have
Hemant.
a question. I have a question. Sir, how many people are basically elites in a state? Maybe only 5% or 10%.
Yeah.
How can we say that there is not much demand?
Oh, I think the thought is that the government responds to elite demand, but it doesn't respond to the demands of non-elites. Again, I think Hemant, you're making a point. The argument will be flawed. We're still at this interpretation stage of figuring out what is being argued. But you could well say, look, this is not true because governments respond to demands across the board, and just because the elites are not demanding it doesn't mean that the government isn't willing to, maybe the government is trying, maybe there are other constraints, that there's the lack of funds, and that's what explains why the state of the cities are bad. So again, remember in this kind of two-stage moment where what we were doing right now was at the interpretation stage. What's the conclusion? What are the premises? How do we need to add implicit premises that were not in the passage? Once we have that, then you can do the Hemant style evaluation. Look, is this a good argument? Well, is it really true that there's a lack of demand for services? After all, elites are a very small fraction of the inhabitants of the city. Somebody who's the Namita Bhandare would have to explain more why she thinks that non-elite demands don't get the same kind of
and even
traction.
Even sir, in COVID, we have seen all the things basically. We have experience.
So we might agree. India is a highly privatized.
Basically, and in the UK, almost 75 to 80% is healthcare are under government control.
Yeah, India's healthcare
is in other developed countries, healthcare is also more than 60 to like 80% are under government control. This sector is not privatized there, but in India, it's a big issue.
Yeah, it's a scandal in India. The US is also a scandalous country because healthcare is highly privatized. In Britain, there's what's called the National Health Service. Health Service, the NHS, which is a public body, which is you can get essentially health pretty much free at state cost. Okay, so I saw Piyush, Sumedha, and then Rajiv has a question. So we'll go through this and then we'll get on to the next topic. Piyush.
Yes, sir. Sir, I think the author has used the word stake in here because the elite of India have choice to go to the privatized sector or the government sector. Since they have no stake in the public services, they don't demand any better quality as compared to if the non-elite people, they don't have any choice. They have to go to the government services. So they don't have any stake in it. Nothing's being risked for them. If the quality even degrades, they still have to go there. They have no
choice. They can't punish the government. I mean, look, this could be true or this could not be true, right? I mean, presumably they can vote the government out. So again, in reading Namita Bhandare's passage, the first thing we're doing is looking at what is the reasons being given. And then the second thing is to ask, are her reasons correct? Sumedha.
Sir, actually, what I was going to say is kind of contributes to evaluation of this passage, not the interpretation.
Okay.
So
go ahead.
What I was saying is that maybe a certain like this can be validated as true because the policymakers, the people who are actually forming the government, are counted are considered elites. Like if I'm to name the elites, then all the like people in the government will be part of elites, and they themselves are used they themselves use the privatized services so much that they feel like that they aren't doing this for they are doing this for others. Like there is a difference between when you do it for everyone and you are part of the beneficiaries, and there is a difference when you do it for solely for others. So I guess
I think you're right. If all the top IAS officers and politicians all sent their children to government schools, I'm sure you'd see much more investment in government schools than you do now. But I'm sure like 85% of them probably send their kids to private schools.
And that is apparent from the examples of other countries, like for example, public transport. The public transport of Japan is like the top-notch public transport system in the whole wide world, and that's because people uniformly use it, and that's why the maintenance goes in there.
In fact, public transport is a good example. In Delhi, the amount of money that goes in, let's say, building flyovers.
In China as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of. I think China has most PSUs in the world. There.
Most PSUs.
Yeah, public sector companies.
That's right. Yeah. So it's a highly state-driven sector. Anyway, so this is the kind of argument that Namita Bhandare is making, right? And I think it's true, for instance, in the case of public transport.
So public transport can't be counted as true. So, because if we take example of Bombay, most of the people there are using local trains, even in Kolkata.
Yeah.
There's no improvement in the maintenance of there.
Again, I imagine that the elites who, if Mukesh Ambani started using the local trains, I'm sure you'd find that the local trains in Bombay would improve dramatically. Or for that matter, Uddhav Thackeray, right? It's the people in power have some sense of how these things work, then they have an incentive to make them work better. That's the kind of picture that Bhandare is pointing out. There's a fantastic book, by the way, on this question by a man. It's one of the, I would say, one of the 10 best books to read non-fiction, called Exit, Voice and Loyalty, which is just on this kind of issue. Okay, Rajiv, why is this named Real Pro? It's just they divide up these exercises into levels of difficulty. So there's pro, there's easy, starter, expert. So this is supposed to be amongst the most difficult. We've only kind of skimmed the surface of it. If I was to ask you this in an assignment, I'd want you to write down the premises in numbered form in the way they do in the textbook, and that would not be so easy. Okay, so what we're going to do now is take a quick break for 5 minutes and then come back and talk about the next topic of maybe for the rest of the week, which is this notion of validity. Yeah, so I have 17:52. Let's take a break for 5 minutes and come back at 1757. I'm switching off my video and audio. Take a stretch, take a walk, and back. Okay, so we're back now, and the plan is to talk about the notion of validity. And so now we're moving into the evaluation stage of arguments. And there are lots of different ways, well, there are lots of different kinds of arguments, there are many different ways to evaluate them. And this notion of validity, which is really comes from mathematics and logic, um, is the strongest kind of argument, is one where there's a kind of foolproof connection between the premises and the conclusion, and that so the just I've said in different ways what is the game of or the activity of critical thinking, right? We're trying to we're trying to evaluate whether the premises provide good justificatory reasons for believing the conclusion. And so one part of that is to ask, what is the evidentiary relationship or the justificatory relationship between the premises and the conclusion? And the strongest possible relationship is the relationship of validity. And a valid argument is one where essentially if the premises are true, then the conclusion must or we can frame it in the in a negative sense. You can say it is not possible for the premises true and the conclusion to be not possible is a matter of logic. So you can see, I spoke, I think once earlier in the class about the way in which this kind of philosophy has owed its origins to thinking about the structure of proofs, and mathematical proofs are often seen as um, the gold standard when it comes to arguments, and the standard of validity is the standard that you would expect for a mathematical proof. And this is a nice kind of framing. Valid arguments are truth conducive. If the premises are true, we just got that. So they're like truth pipes. If you put in a true premise, here's what you are guaranteed if you have a valid argument, which is you have a true conclusion. And so this if is very important. Let's work out a few examples that give you a feel for the notion. And the set of examples really give some context or give some meaning to the term truth conducive. And it's important to see the connection between the validity of an argument and the truth and falsity of its premises and conclusions. Excuse me. So can I have a volunteer to read some of this case stuff? Hemant, you've already gone, so we'll go for Sumedha. So
Yes,
Sumedha, why don't you start from this, an argument can be valid.
Okay. An argument can be valid even if the premises are untrue, just as pipe can be perfect and without any leaks, even if there is no water poured on the top. Example, there are more than 10 people in this room. Therefore, there is at least one person in this room. This argument is valid.
Let's go to the next example. Let's work through the examples. And yeah.
Okay. All professors of literature are men. Any field of work which contains only men is missing vital perspectives. So literature is missing vital perspectives.
Okay.
This argument
okay. Let's just pause and think about these, about what they're trying to say. So the point about this passage is that it's a valid argument regardless of the truth or falsity of this premise. What the argument says, the premise is there are more than 10 people in this room, and the conclusion is that there is at least one person in this room. And you can see that it's a valid argument, because if the premise is true, if this is true, then this is also true. And you can see that the validity of that statement doesn't depend upon whether there are in fact more than 10 people in this room. And so validity is a purely logical connection between two statements. It doesn't tell you anything about the truth of the premises themselves. And let's see, if you look at the professors of literature example, I think you can see that the argument is valid, right? If all professors of literature are men, and if any field of work which contains only men is missing vital perspectives, then it must be the case that literature is missing vital perspectives. And one way of seeing that, and you've probably done this, and all of you have taken some introductory logic class, I'm assuming. You can always put that into some kind of symbolic logic form and see that it's true. Are you guys familiar with that whole thing, symbolic logic and putting
yes,
things?
From the course in discrete mathematics.
Standard discrete mathematics. Is that true for everyone? Anyone here who's not taken like is discrete mathematics? It's a required course, right, for everyone?
No, sir. Actually, not.
Okay, so let me just point out, and it's an important, in some ways a very deep point in this example. So Sumita, how would you be able to, how would you transcribe this into symbolic logic?
I'm using prepositions. So my statement P will be all professors of literature are men, and Q will be any field like that. And the R will be like result will be, so literature is missing vital perspectives, and I'll just say P and Q implies R.
So hang on. So all Q is what?
Q is any field of work which contains only men is missing vital perspectives.
This is not going to show that it's a valid argument, perspectives, and R is the conclusion, right?
Yeah.
Lit is missing. Okay, Arun.
I'd rather denote these by Venn diagram.
Could do that.
I'd take a big circle,
yeah,
which is men. Then I'd draw a smaller circle in that, which would be all professors of literature, because all professors of literature are men, so it would be a subset of men. And then and then I would draw that outside men a big circle, which is fields that lack vital perspective.
Okay.
Because any field that contains only men would lack vital perspective. So the set of all men would be under the, I should say, the set of vital fields lacking vital perspective. So it would be that set of professors of literature would be under the fields or lacking vital perspective. So literature would be lacking vital perspective.
Okay, so you could see it in that way as well. I won't. It'll take too long to write this out in symbolic form, but I hope you can see the logic of it. What is the point that they want to make? Look, it's a valid argument, but the premise is false, because in fact it's not true. The first premise is false. All professors of literature are not men. In fact, if you look at our department, most of our professors of literature are women. But nevertheless, it's a logically valid argument, or we just say a valid argument. Why is that a deep point? I said it's a deep point that the thought is that logic by itself can't tell you anything about the world. In order to know whether something is true or false, you need to know what the world is like. And so while validity is this very key important relationship between premises and conclusions, whether or not an argument is valid doesn't directly tell you whether the premises are true or the conclusion is true. So we've just seen two cases where you have a valid argument, and in this case you can see it would be valid whether or not the premise is true. Here you have another valid argument, and you can see that it's a valid argument even though the first premise is false. Let's see. So Sumit, I want to, let's have somebody else. Let's have somebody who's not spoken as yet. One more volunteer to read out. Out of 16 people. Who's not? Somebody who's not read so far today. Okay, Sujit. Sujit, and then we go for Piyush. So let's just read out this example.
Yeah, India is the most densely populated country in the world. It's got more people than any other country, and its surface area is smaller than any other country.
Okay, valid argument?
Yeah, it's not valid that its surface area is smaller than any other country.
So in terms of the definition of validity that we
No,
have.
it's valid, but it's not
this
true.
is valid, but
Yeah, but it's not true.
incorrect.
So why
Because
is it valid?
premises are false. Like its surface area is smaller than any other country is false, and it's got more people than any other country. That's also false.
Hang on. So why is it valid?
Because premises do imply the density. Like if it were true that the population is the highest and the surface area is the lowest, then the density would be highest.
So that just follows from the definition of density, right?
Yeah.
So therefore it's a valid argument. And why is it but yet it's a false conclusion. India is not the most densely populated country in the world. Anyone knows what is the most densely populated country?
Japan.
Is Bangladesh.
I'm confused between those two.
Bangladesh, okay. So nice, right? So this is an example of a valid argument with a false conclusion. What is something that if we know that is if you have a valid argument with a false conclusion, do we learn anything? Can we, if we know this, can we take away anything about its premises?
At least one of the premises should be false.
Right. So we know that much, that if you have the only way for a valid argument to have a false conclusion is that it must have a false premise. So that is an important takeaway. And why do they have this contract? This contrast? Well, valid arguments can have false premises. Valid arguments can have false conclusions. Valid arguments obviously can have.
Sir, can you repeat what did you say? Valid arguments must have false premises.
No, if you have a valid argument with a false conclusion, then you know that it must have a false premise.
Yeah, of course, sir.
Yeah, that just follows from the definition of validity.
Because that's why conclusion will be false then.
Yeah. The only way the conclusion could be false if the argument is valid is if at least one premise is false. So to recap, so valid arguments can have false premises, they can have false conclusions, they can have true premises. So let's well, if a valid if a valid argument has true premises, you know it has to have a true conclusion. Piyush, let's look at these two examples. The Alok is smiling and the groundwater level. Why do you read these out?
Alok is smiling, therefore he is happy.
So let's think about that. Is it the case that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true?
No, sir, the argument might be invalid.
Well, the argument is invalid if it's possible for the premise to be true and the conclusion false. What's the scenario where that might be so?
So this is one of the scenarios.
What?
So person may be smiling, but he may not be necessarily happy.
Yeah.
He may be pretending, right, for whatever reason.
Sure, yeah. So smiling also doesn't necessarily imply happiness.
In general, smiling may not imply happiness. So what's the takeaway? I mean, there are many things one can take away from the argument, from the example. Look, often it is the case that when you're smiling, you're happy. And sometimes it's not a bad thing to reason that from the fact that somebody is smiling, they are in fact happy. But there's this logical possibility. The logical possibility is that you may be smiling and nevertheless you might be happy. And as long as that logical possibility exists, you have to say that the argument is invalid. And again, suppose you can imagine a situation where in fact Alok is smiling and Alok is in fact happy. And even if the premise is true and the conclusion is true, nevertheless, the argument is an invalid argument. Example, the groundwater levels. Piyush, when do you read this one?
Yes, sir. Groundwater levels are falling rapidly across Bangalore. Therefore, Bangalore has stopped expanding.
Okay. Valid argument? Again, the only question you have to ask if it's a valid argument is it possible for this to be true and for this to be false?
Yeah, it would be false. It is invalid argument.
So what's the scenario in which this is true, but this is false?
So many of the towns in Maharashtra.
So many of towns in Maharashtra, groundwater levels are falling, but nevertheless they're still expanding.
Yeah.
And they may be expanding for many different reasons, right? The book points out that maybe nobody's noticed, and so construction hasn't slowed down. what's the takeaway point here? Well, in the case of Bangalore, this is true. And they are saying that the conclusion is also true. But the point is that the connection, the justificatory connection between the premise and the conclusion, that is what doesn't hold. And that's why the argument is an invalid argument. So but if you think of the business of evaluation of arguments, we're basically evaluating the strength of the therefore here and here.
Yeah. Sir, in the starting, we said that if the premises are true, then conclusion must be true.
That's right. So given that we are now giving two examples.
No, this is in starting we said that argument must be valid. Yeah.
So valid arguments have the property that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. These are examples where the premises could be true and the conclusion false, and therefore these are examples of invalid arguments.
Okay.
Make sense?
Makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to leave aside for the moment this discussion between deductive arguments and inductive arguments, but the kind of TLDR of it is that just because an argument is invalid doesn't mean it's a bad argument. And we'll see after a couple of weeks a class of arguments that there are good arguments even if they're not valid. But that's another, really another section of the course. And again, philosophically quite, there are lots of philosophically quite deep and interesting questions in the neighborhood, which maybe we'll try and get at in the tutorials. But let me leave you with this thought for the next few minutes, which is, what do you do with deductive arguments? So a deductive argument is an argument that looks like it's aspiring to validity. The kind of, maybe that's not a fully clear notion in the abstract, but deductive arguments are the kinds of things that we do this premise and conclusion, and we think that the strength of the therefore is this very tight logical connection, and essentially when you're faced with these possible responses, we can either just accept the conclusion. We say this is an argument. We think, look, it has two premises, therefore, because it's a valid argument, it must have a true conclusion. Or we can say, hey, it's a valid argument, but one of the premises is false. And in that case, we really can't say anything about the conclusion. When when you have a valid argument with a false premise, well, it could be, the conclusion could be true, or the conclusion needn't be true. The argument itself won't it won't tell you that. That if you think about the examples we had right at the start, think about these cases. Argument is valid and this premise is false. The conclusion might still be true, right? So maybe many female professors of literature exist. Maybe literature is still missing vital perspectives. Can you think of an example of that?
I think, sir, we can say that there are very less black philosophers, or there are very less Dalit philosophers.
Yeah, you could say that. Look, this conclusion is still true, but the reason it's true is because
caste diversity and race diversity is not there.
Yeah, it may be that there's no caste diversity, or there's, as you say, race diversity. So when you have again, remember, this is a valid argument. When you have a valid argument with a false premise, you can't really conclude anything about the conclusion. It could be true, or it could be false. The argument doesn't tell you that um, uh, by itself. So let's go back into this. Yeah, so you can accept the conclusion. You can deny at least one of the premises. So we can say that, yeah, it's a valid argument, but we can't, this is what I was saying, we can't conclude anything from it because the such and such premise is false. And to say that a premise is false, you have to kind of check it against the world, right? You have to see, okay, I don't know, what is the caste diversity of the of this field of literature. And then the third thing you can do is deny that the argument is valid. And again, you can deny that the argument is valid. And by itself, if you deny that the argument is valid, you're claiming that this chain of reasoning is not a tight chain. And so the argument might be invalid, but just from that you can't automatically say the conclusion is false or the premises are false. When you learn that an argument is invalid, what you learn is you don't have to accept the truth of the conclusions from an acceptance of the truth of the premises. So that's one important takeaway, is to distinguish kind of the notion of validity as a justificatory relationship and the question of truth as some kind of matching about, whether the world is actually the way it is, the way the world is actually the way it is described in either the premises or the conclusion. So we'll come back to this question in the class on Thursday. What I want to do is just talk more about the notion of validity, maybe have a little bit of a discussion of some of the material on inductive versus deductive arguments that you have in the text, and do a little quick overview of what we've done in the first 6 weeks. And hopefully I'll have your minor one assignment question also, and you can, we can talk about that as well. Piyush, you were going to say something?
Yes, sir. Could you write that line in the chat? You just said about the acceptance line.
Sure, I'll say that. I can't even remember what I said. I was talking about, so if an argument is invalid, relationship between premises and conclusions. I'm just going to say does that make sense, Piyush?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so what we're going to do now, we're out of time. Let's take a 10-minute break, and whoever's joining for the session with Sujoy, let's log on at 6:35 or 6:36. I'll tell him that we're running 5 minutes late, and this is an agendaless talk. So I hope that you'll bring to it questions you had from his presentation. The PPT is online on Piazza, or for that matter, other questions that you might have about advertising, about really anything at all. He's a fun guy to talk to.
So you
So
can provide the PPT of that
I
class.
have it's on Piazza.
Have you uploaded
Yeah,
today?
yeah.
Okay, okay.
So take a look at
Thank
it
you.
in the next 10 minutes.
So,
And yeah, Sujit.
yeah, sir, can I invite a friend to attend the session?
Sure, no problem.
Okay. Thank you.
Right. See you in 10 minutes. Jojo is just joining in a minute. I'm going to turn off recording.